FDA Monthly Podcast. I am Stephen Garvey, FDA Executive Director. I will be chairing the podcast. I would like to welcome invited guest, Mr. Brian Seaman, legal researcher for the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Centre, and Mr. Adam Idris, former director of the Muslim Council of Calgary. Tonight the podcast will focus on how can money interests, big money interests, be disconnected from democratic processes. This is part 2 of the FDA's Money and Democracy podcast series. I'm going to open the floor now and ask the panelists to give opening statements on where they stand on this. Brian?
Thank you, Stephen, and hi, Adam. Nice to see you again. Well, I'll start by saying that I don't think, practically speaking, that big money interest can be divorced from the political process. So I think the question that then goes begging to be asked is how do we, if not minimize the influence that big money has in the political process, how do we ensure that that influence is at least counterbalanced? And I think that one of the most important ways that immediately comes to mind is to ensure that we have a broad franchise. If you look at the history of democracies in general, and most particularly this country, in the early days of this country's history, at the time of Confederation, only 11% of the populace indeed had the right to vote. They were all male, they were all white. Asians did not have the right to vote. African Canadians did not have the right to vote. Indians and Aboriginals did not have the right to vote. And indeed, people who did not own, men who did not own property did not have the right to vote. So over the decades, we've had, thankfully, an expansion of the franchise so that now every adult citizen in this country, every adult citizen over the age of 18 has the right to vote. So that's one of the ways in which you countervail that prevalence of money is to have a broad-based franchise. Can we minimize the influence of money? Yes, but we're not going to be able to remove it altogether. And I think, like with anything, big money can be a two-edged sword. We have the example of, in this country and in America, of large money from the corporate sector dominating the ideological agenda of the Republican Party in the United States and the Conservative Party here. On the other hand, we also have people with money who support progressive causes. Robert Redford. What's Robert Redford's net worth? Hundreds of millions of dollars. Robert Redford is an environmentalist. The Kennedy family, a very wealthy, iconic American family on the liberal side of the spectrum in the United States, very wealthy, and they are supporting numerous nonprofit organizations that are concerned about the environment. So, as with arguably any other tool in our society, in this case, money, it is a double-edged sword. So I don't think we should remove it from the political process, but I think we need to find ways to countervail the predominance of corporate money, which is influencing the political process.
Adam?
I think in listening to the last podcast, part 1 of this topic, so much of the narrative had to do with how money affects the voters via the media, mass media in particular. I think we need to talk, if we can't control money from influencing the politicians, then perhaps we can talk about money influencing us through effectively communicating how the media operates. And if we can't control it on one side, then we can control it on another side. Indeed, the media, we could actually set benchmarks that are far more easier to track and easier to enforce with the media because there are quantifiable measures that we could actually enforce with regards to debates, with regards to time spent on each specific candidate or each specific political party or ad space. We can actually effectively track that. So where we can't prevent a third party from going out and advocating on behalf of a specific candidate or a specific political party, we can have groups tracking the amount of time specific media outlets spend on a specific candidate or party. Even if it was a third party that was paying for ad space, it just wouldn't be allowed because we would have rules. So I think that attacking it from the donor side or the recipient side is a lost cause. It really is, in my opinion, just because this is a problem that's existed for thousands of years. our way of life as Canadians is informed to a large extent by what is happening south of our border. The majority of our inputs we get from the United States. Canadians know more about the American political system than the Canadian political system. You'd be able to ask the average Canadian about Mitt Romney versus Rick Santorum versus Newt Gingrich versus the Democrats, versus Obama. They are more comfortable speaking about that. So just the inputs that we're getting are from the U.S. So we've actually already become conditioned to what was called in the last podcast the insatiable hunger for money in politics, this unquenchable thirst that will never, ever be satisfied. So I think that we'd be fighting a losing battle by actually looking at mechanisms from the donor and recipient side. We're going to have to actually start looking at externalities as a way of coping with this problem. And I think that is probably the direction that we are most likely to get results from.
So would you consider, like in Alberta, they have electoral finance transparency. Would you consider that an externality?
It all depends on how it's carried out. If you have these committees have a tendency of being politically motivated and politically charged to begin with, when you have the people benefiting from a specific outcome that are actually making the rules that need to be abided by, those rules are either going to be broken, massaged, or totally avoided. The thing is that we are all conditioned to look at two things: risk versus reward. Oftentimes, these rules will be blatantly broken because by the time it's established that the rules have been broken, the election has already come and gone, the damage has already been done, and you got another 2 or 3 years of questioning and tribunals and investigations to establish whether somebody did something that may or may not have been illegal, and then even then it's not even a criminal code violation. It would be the very definition of a slap on the wrist. It's not even a slap on the wrist. So I think
they can actually, in Alberta, through the electoral complaint process, if they're caught committing fraud related to an election, they can be removed from office. So it's more than a slap on the wrist.
Yeah, but that's I mean, I think fraud is different than paying a third party to run ads for you. That's
Indeed
not fraud.
It is, and the removing somebody from office is after the fact. I think what Adam has alluded to in his opening statement is something very serious which we need to take a very serious look at. The electoral reforms in Alberta, although an important step forward, do not go far enough. We only have a right to vote once every 4 or 5 years. What is critical, I think, and Adam has alluded to it, and I think it's important that this discussion evolve in this direction, not only tonight, but in the wider public policy arena, is how opinions and attitudes are shaped. Indeed, I'll even use the word manipulated by powerful elites between elections 24/7 in our media-saturated universe. There are two very important areas where I think we need to absolutely have reform, and both of these areas go towards increasing transparency in the process. First area is, I think we need electoral reform in a law that would require lobbyists, NGOs to disclose who their donors are. And indeed, I would go so far as to require NGOs, whatever that NGO is, to do what we have to do. The NGO where I work, the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Centre, has to hire a CPA every year, and we must submit to an audit. I think that there has to be transparency. There's no secret as to who our donors are, but who are the donors behind Ezra Levant's Ethical Oil Group, for example? Only today, I read that 3 of the major players in the oil patch, which are, surprise, surprise, the 3 biggest American oil companies, donate money to Ezra Levant's so-called grassroots, small guy lobby group that's interested in ensuring that there's support for Alberta's oil industry. That should be publicly disclosed. When I read an article in the Chronicle, in the local paper, condemning environmental groups as being funded by foreign radicals, I have a right to know where the money is coming from to support this expert or this NGO. I think that we as citizens have a right to know that the oil industry is funding these lobbyists who are writing off environmentalists as radicals funded by foreigners. And that leads into my second point, which is related, and that's this term called astroturfing. The Research Centre has actually been considering doing a report on astroturfing. AstroTurf, as you know, is that fake sod in most major ball fields. And in the public policy arena, astroturfing is a buzzword which means a fake grassroots campaign, right? Where all of a sudden there'll be some proposed consumer legislation or some new regulations to improve the environment, some more stringent environmental regulations, and all of a sudden within hours you'll be reading on blogs, all of these posts which purport to come from, Little Joe and Little Jane, and they're saying, oh, this is terrible. I mean, if we bring in regulations, more stringent regulations on the oil patch, it'll mean the oil industry is going to collapse and Albertans are going to be out of work. Well, thankfully there are a few concerned souls out there who work for places like the Pembina Institute, the Parkland Institute, who are not making big money but who are concerned about the environment, who, weeks or months later will be reading reports in Alberta Reports or Alberta Views about how, oh, lo and behold, this so-called grassroots campaign is actually being funded by oil companies. So we need to find out who is behind these so-called grassroots campaigns. Adam has alluded to the fact that the United States, has a huge influence on Canadian affairs. I mean, we're all familiar with the Tea Party down in the United States. Well, the Tea Party is funded by very wealthy backers of the Republican Party, the right wing of the Republican Party, to sow discontent and indeed to sow disinformation out there amongst people to deliberately obfuscate the democratic process. And I don't think the democratic process is indeed served by this kind of deliberate misinformation.
Problem is, how does one, when we say that private members, or private citizens, Ezra Levant is a private citizen, he's advocating a specific agenda, to be sure. We're allowed as private citizens to advocate specific agendas. We're even allowed to get books published. I mean, if somebody's going to, if a publishing house is going to take our manuscript and print off a couple 100,000 copies or a couple thousand copies, then there's nothing that anybody could say or do about it. The problem is, how do we get private citizens to publicly disclose who's supporting them? I think that right there might be a bit of a stretch, a bit of a reach. He's not technically involved in politics. He is a third party, just like you or just like me or just like Stephen or anybody else. So how does one actually hold them accountable for where they're getting their resources to actually pursue this narrow agenda? And the narrow agenda, it's not a big secret. It's support of our oil industry. So how do we get around that? It looks like there's competing priorities. We've already established, well, the U.S. Supreme Court and the Citizens United established that money equals speech. Speech can't be limited, and therefore money can't be limited. That right there is an intersection of two competing priorities. The desire to maintain the integrity of the information that people are getting, especially because their vote is going to be predicated based on the quality of the information, and the other priority, and that is to allow people to express themselves. And the only way to be able to express yourself on something like a national election is by spending money. So I think that there's a real problem with compelling third parties to disclose what their agendas are, if they have agendas, or who they're getting their money from. I think that's going to be a little bit tough. And does transparency really matter? So Americans in the United States in the last election the last federal election, the Democrats, led by, their candidate spent $800 million on an election. Did that disgust Americans to the extent that they didn't vote for him? Were people outraged? Was it even a big story? Did it matter? I mean, people still voted for him. Right now, the stories are that the Koch brothers and the Republican Party and the Tea Party and all these people are spending tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, and the Democrats are gearing up for what they're saying could be the first $1 billion campaign in the entire planet's history. Does transparency matter? Do these numbers really resonate with the voter?
What about Arab Spring? No one saw that coming.
No.
So my point to you is perhaps in the U.S. populace, it's simmering.
People are, unless it affects people at a very, very basic and personal and fundamental level. Arab Spring, we're talking 25% unemployment, in some places 40% unemployment. People were having a tough time feeding their kids. Outright, overt corruption, which I think, if Arab style, we haven't gotten there yet. We're quite a ways away from being Arab style corrupt.
We're actually worse in Alberta.
That's a big shock.
We actually are. This is in the FDA Alberta Electoral Fairness Report. It's part of a report that's coming out very recently. But just to give you a figure, we looked at the reign of Mubarak in Egypt versus the reign of the PC parties in Alberta. Just to give you a couple of basic facts here. Mubarak was in power, his party was in power for about 30 years. The PC party has been in power for about 40 years now and counting. But in terms of the finances, in terms of income and quality, the top 20% in Egypt in around 1979, when it was at the middle of the regime, it had 2.9% more wealth than the bottom 20%. In Alberta, in 1999, and it's actually worse now, it had the top 20% had 14.4% times more wealth than the bottom 20%.
I think that gulf is getting bigger, and I think that when you allow for hyper-capitalism, like we've embraced hyper-capitalism, and we've embraced it, every element of it. We've opened up the gates, and we've less so in Canada, but again, it's only a matter of time, because this is something that it doesn't put itself in check. It just grows and grows and grows. And I think that's why that disparity is growing. And it's not just growing in Alberta, but it's growing all over the world. The top, I'm going to call them earners, their wealth is growing at unprecedented rates, while the people on the bottom are struggling far more than they ever have, and that's going to continue. But that's all over the place. That's all over the world.
Can I add a footnote there, just to put this in context? According to a 2011 study by sociologist John Miles, Alberta has the fastest growing gap between the rich and poor in Canada. And to put this in further context, the top 1% in Alberta has as much wealth as the bottom 53%.
That doesn't surprise me. And I would like to return to that discussion, this digression about hyper-capitalism in a moment. But I first want to return to something Adam had said when you were discussing, we were using the example of Visual Event. I mean, it could be anyone, any private citizen who is attempting to influence public opinion for his or her own purposes. I think the distinction which we can make is, as long as Levant or Jane Doe or Joe Blow is private citizen hawking his or her books and is not an incorporated, registered NGO, even more tellingly with a charitable tax number, then, I think that as you had alluded, what can we do? I mean, I don't have to tell you or you how much money I make. I don't have to tell you or you if I'm working for another employer and making some money on the side. However, if I had incorporated myself as Brian Seaman Incorporated, NGO, with a registered tax number, and I'm getting donations, then I am required, and I should be required, to disclose who is donating to me. So I don't know. I mean, maybe either of you would know the answer. I don't know whether Ethical Oil, and I'm not sure whether that's the name of Levant's lobby or group or not, but that's what they do. He's pushing this ethical oil agenda, whether they are indeed a registered, incorporated entity. Then at that point, I think that's the distinction, that you should be required to disclose who your donors are. And I think it is important for those of us to know, and because that group or NGO is incorporated pursuant to law, then that puts them into the public sphere. Now, the term hyper-capitalism that both of you have alluded to, that is a fact of our modern age. And I don't know whether it's even hyper-capitalism so much as it's more unregulated financial speculation. I have no problem personally as a small L liberal with the notion of capitalism. I mean, one of my favorite stories is of a friend of mine, Peter, back in Nova Scotia, who, when he first started out as a courier driver, it was him and his girlfriend working out of Peter's basement. And he now has a company, which is the largest courier company east of Montreal. And I first met Peter when he was about to make that leap from 4 drivers into 12 drivers and then 30 drivers in a warehouse. And at that point, he had all of his assets and his girlfriend's assets pledged on the line, including the house that they owned, to secure a line of credit. That, to me, is a classic example of a true capitalist, somebody who has taken risk and has put his or her financial integrity on the line, has grown, and they deserve profits. Where I have severe problems is with the unregulated financial industry, which began under Reagan in the 80s, and we can't let Clinton in the United States off this as well, because deregulation continued under the Democrats as it did under the Republicans. So we now have, we do have a stricter controls in the Canadian banking and financial industry, but in the United States and throughout Europe, for that matter, it's basically the Wild West, and we now have people who are doing day trades, gambling with our futures. And we have, of course, the examples of Enron, where you have insiders who are basically raping the companies for their own profit. And this is not classic capitalism. This is white-collar theft. I don't think we'd call it anything else but.
There's another example that's going on that I want to share with you. I just recently uncovered there's actually NGO-type organizations in the States funded by big corporations like Esso, and their mandate is to actually write the legislation. State governments in the U.S. So they actually write the legislation in their favor on a particular subject, give it to the politician, and the politician passes the legislation as if it's his or her own.
That's not very surprising. That's a very, very small step from industry leaders becoming politicians. Because essentially what you would have is you'd have somebody who is as a captain of a specific industry, a CEO or a director of some kind, and then he takes the leap into politics, and essentially they're charged with writing legislation. So for me, it's not a big stretch, and I don't like having to keep on going back to American politics, but that seems to be how it works. One person is he's a CEO or a director of or a senior manager of a pharmaceutical company or an oil company or a media conglomerate, and then they move into politics, and their entire political life is identified. It's tunnel vision on how to get specific favor for the industry that they just departed from. If there was ever a better example than Dick Cheney, then he did it right out in the open. And were there people marching? Were there riots? Were people outraged to the extent that it actually mattered, transparency or not? If it was right out in the open, if every check he ever wrote or every check he ever received was right out in the open, and people read it on the front page of their newspapers every single day, 365 days a year, would it matter? And unfortunately, the answer is no. We just don't care enough about our political system to actually stand up and say, we can't allow this to happen. My issue right now is unless the public has an appetite to actually stand up and demonstrate how outraged they are by this type of activity, transparency doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Have we passed? I mean, maybe I'm being too. I may be accused of being naive here, but have we passed a bit of a high watermark regarding that? Because it's now common knowledge that Halliburton, of which Dick Cheney was one of the main directors, rebuilt Iraq after Iraq had its infrastructure blown apart during the American invasion.
And there were no bid contracts. And
No, that's right.
The
That's right.
distasteful part was that nobody else had a chance to.
No. So the the United States whipped up patriotic fever following 9/11, and lied to an American populace that was, pretty much united behind the American war effort until gradually people like Noam Chomsky, leading the way, started to raise some doubts about weapons of mass destruction, and now many people are very aware of the intimate relationship between Halliburton and Big Oil and American foreign policy in the post-9/11 world. I just wonder whether we've reached some kind of high watermark, because now the drums of war are being beaten in favor of some kind of an attack on Iran. Whether it's some kind of a surgical strike to take out the Iranian nuclear facilities or an all-out war against Iran. And yet I've been reading on the blogs. I mean, there seems to be some kind of a shift in opinion where you're still going to have, the rednecks who are all in favor of, wiping out the ragheads and let's just wipe them out because America's interests are at stake. But interspersed amongst the this bigoted and it's my country right or wrong opinion, is it just me, or I just seem to see a growing number and perhaps even a preponderance of people are saying, you know what, wait a minute, let's step back here and ask whose interests are served by attacking Iran and making an Iraq out of Iran. It just seems to me like there's a growing number of people who are connecting the dots between the military-industrial complex, the oil industry, and a very entrenched and powerful Israeli lobby in the United States, and a growing number of Americans and, Canadians, Britons for that matter, are connecting some dots and saying, hang on here a minute, we've been lied to once before, I don't think we're going to be fooled again.
I wish that people were connecting the dots, because there is a pushback right now against getting into another foolhardy war in the Middle East for vague and really undefined reasons. But that has nothing to do with an overriding principle of should we get involved in a war that doesn't serve us. That has to do with dollars and cents. They don't want to get involved in another war because they don't want to spend the money doing it, because it was $1 trillion war, not to mention the loss of life, not to mention all of the other externalities that are associated with war, the hundreds of thousands of soldiers that are now coming back to a workforce that doesn't exist.
That doesn't employ them.
That doesn't employ them. I think if they had the bulging war chests that they had of 10 years ago, then they would get involved, and the American people would be right back to beating the drums and going back to war. Right now, it's just they're so broken. The people are so keenly aware of how much the war cost. That's the reason that they're not getting involved. And this actually connects very, very nicely to our fundamental conversation about money and politics, because my position is all the transparency in the world is not going to matter to a public that does not care. The public doesn't really care, unfortunately. And this is where the rubber hits the road, gentlemen. If the public isn't outraged by the numbers that you were talking about in Alberta, or on the broader picture, Canada, or in the United States, if people aren't really bringing their frustrations out en masse, then this is all for naught.
I've voiced these numbers to people recently, and they do impact. Most times I get a defensive response. Oh, I'd rather be living here than in Egypt under Mubarak.
Or Nova Scotia.
But that argument in and of itself recognizes the wrongness of what's going on. So that's positive.
No, nobody's going to stand up and say that it's right.
Yeah.
Even the most ardent advocate of our current political system isn't going to say that it's right. The problem is that we live in a world of risk versus reward. If you can get away with it, you'll do it. And even if you can't get away with it, you'll do it based on how severe the punishment is. And if voters aren't making political parties pay for these decisions and for these malfeasance and for these scandals, for these backroom deals, for a government that has been overrun by lobbyists, then really what good is transparency?
Exactly. Look at Alberta. There's been one party in power for 40 years and counting.
But that might in and of itself, that might not necessarily be the worst thing. I mean, okay, if that party was a good party, would that be a bad thing? If for 40 years they were the best party that represented the will of Albertans, that might not be a bad thing. 40 years is a long time, yes, but I mean, who's to say that that's the reason that we should cite, that should be the thing that we cite to prove that our democracy is broken? The only way that we could actually do that is to say that they've been misleading people or stealing elections or making it totally unfair for everybody else. That's the only time that we should have a problem with a 40-year reign.
The FDA is putting out a report in a couple of weeks, and as far as we're concerned, doing this detailed audit on the system, there's a zone of 45% unfairness, which is linked to the media, linked to electoral finance, and some other areas of the system. In our opinion, it's actually allowed them to stay in power, and it's also created huge inequities in the system. For example, over the last two elections, the PC party has had more electoral campaign monies, more than double than the rest of all the other parties combined.
But the problem is that their donor base is so much bigger. Their donor base is so much bigger than all of the other parties combined. So it would stand to reason that if their donor base is...
It's not just that. It's actually a complex issue because you got to link in the media, and the media is completely biased to the PC party, and they feed off each other. And
there is a convergence or a confluence of thinking, groupthink I call it, and I think that the way to counterbalance that is to continue asking the probing questions and doing the reports they're doing, and those of us who are concerned about accountability and transparency and change to start asking the questions that will make people wake up and start thinking about whether or not their interests are truly being served by this confluence of power. I mean, I'm not from Alberta originally. I lived here for a little over 11 years, long enough, I think, to have a pretty good idea for the pulse of this province. And we have in this province this Heritage Fund, which has $7.5 billion in it, which in real dollars is much less than the money that Peter Lougheed first put into that back in the late 70s during Alberta's first oil boom. He put in $10 or $11 billion into it. You know, little Norway, in comparison with slightly more population than Alberta has, little Norway, when it developed its North Sea oil industry back around the same time, in the mid-70s, also set up a heritage fund. Little Norway, which our own Prime Minister, when he was opposition leader, in a memorable speech he made down in the United States before a conservative audience, he sneeringly referred to Canada as a second-rate northern socialist country. Well, excuse me, but this little second-rate northern socialist European country, their comparable heritage fund is worth over $500 billion. Why has Norway been able to grow its fund and Alberta has not? I mean, I think this is a question that if I were wanting to stay in Alberta for the rest of my life and have my children grow up here, I think I would want to know the answer to that. So maybe that's how we start reaching people, is through their pocketbook, because I think, I don't think you're entirely cynical. I think you're a realist, and I think when you say that most people really only take an interest in an issue when it affects their pocketbook, I think unfortunately you're right, and I have said the same thing. I mean, how many idealists are there in the world? There aren't too many Gandhis, but there are an awful lot of people who are concerned about their bottom line. Well, does it get any more bottom line than the future of this province? And I think that's a question which we need to ask, is why has Norway been able to do it right and we have done it wrong?
But they've already hijacked. So
who's they?
If you want to call it the power brokers, they've already actually had that dialogue. That's why Albertans are actually saying, well, 1/3 of us are employed by the oil industry. Gee whiz, we need to do everything that we can to help them out. And they cite the decision of Trudeau with the National Energy Plan. And half of the people living in this province is going to tell you a story about how their folks lost their house in the 80s, because, a few months after Trudeau passed the National Energy Plan, and
But that's a myth. That's a myth, and you know it's a myth.
Of course,
I came out here with an open
this is
mind.
a narrative.
I know it's a narrative, but it is a narrative that is false. I came out here with an open mind. I came out here with an open mind, thinking, you know what, I'm going to find some objective evidence to support this theory. So I went to the libraries and thought, surely somebody, some economist, perhaps even Stephen Harper, should have written a thesis on how this national energy program destroyed Alberta's economy. I found nothing. There's nothing out there. It's a myth that's been propagated.
Its oil prices tanked shortly thereafter. It had nothing to do with
it.
Had nothing
and it was
to
a global phenomenon.
But you're
right. It's a
problem
narrative.
is that it's the narrative that's being told. They've already associated their ideology with people's pocketbooks. So for us to show up and cite Norway and make that make the pocketbook argument, we've already been beaten to the punch. This has already happened for the better part of 30 years. That we can't disassociate ourselves from our own best interest, because it's going to make us wind up like everybody that we knew in the 80s who had to sell their houses and beg for money. And the story gets more dramatic as time wears on. I've heard it once, and then I heard it 10 years later, and it's all of a sudden this mythology that's surrounding our disdain for federal politicians out east. It's palpable. So they've already beaten us to the punch about this pocketbook thing, because now we can't make the arguments about our future and future generations with the Heritage Fund. I mean, the Heritage Fund, we're one of the richest political entities on the planet. We have, in terms of proven oil reserves, we're second only to Saudi Arabia. And the lion's share of it is on Alberta. So why do we have, I think, in today dollars, it's 14 or something $billion.
$7.5 billion.
Adjusted for inflation and real dollars, it's declined.
It's smaller than the amount that Lahu put into back in the 70s.
So we've already, we can't make that argument anymore about saying, this is what's going to happen to your pocketbook, because we all know what happens when oil prices go down here in Alberta, and that is not a myth.
The FDA is making the argument that the system is significantly unfair, and that the will of the people is not necessarily being reflected in the assembly. Hopefully, I don't know if that's going to have an impact on the populace. That's another way of approaching people and saying, listen, you're being cheated, it's unfair. The system is rigged for a certain outcome. And we're going to show that. There's huge loopholes in the system which favor the PC party. In talking about Saudi Arabia, we've already done an electoral audit on their system, and we're starting to see parallels with that system. Instead of having the royal family and its huge entourage, we're dealing with this oil and gas class sector dominating the province.
There's that, and also have you found any evidence? I mean, myself and my colleagues and friends have speculated that there's electoral gerrymandering in this province that heavily favors rural ridings. That if this province was truly, if the electoral map of this province was truly designed to reflect the population centers, that, well, we know that slightly more than 2/3 of Albertans live between the cities of Calgary and Edmonton, and yet the percentage of the seats in the legislature does not reflect that. So have you found evidence of there being deliberate gerrymandering that would favor the rural ridings where the Conservatives do have their base?
I don't know if it's deliberate.
But the fact is,
There is that in the legislation,
yeah.
but we didn't. We felt that was reasonable. They have to account for these rural areas that have less population and give them a voice in the legislature.
Mm.
So we didn't see an issue with that. And also it's important to bring in the charter here, because if there's any gerrymandering going on, and if it can be proven, you can sue and get it changed.
I suppose, because
Right.
on the other hand, I mean, to be fair, I mean, a person could then look at the federal system and say, well, why should PEI have, 4 MPs? That means you got 25,000 people per MP, and
Yeah.
PEI, and yet an average of 110,000 people per MP in a city like Calgary. So,
But that's actually an issue in Jordan too.
Yeah.
It's a bigger issue in Jordan, a place like that we looked at. But I haven't seen any evidence of small parties, making claims about this.
But
So we don't feel that that's the big issue.
Yeah.
The big issue that we see is the media,
Yeah.
the media ownership concentrations in Alberta, and the FDA is going to be doing a study on that to see how much influence the huge media conglomerates have in Alberta.
yeah.
So
But
where it pertains to urban centers like Calgary and Edmonton being 2/3 of the population, and that doesn't reflect the amount of MLAs that we have in Alberta, and that rural centers are more highly populated, we also have to be pragmatic that we are urban centers, and our population overwhelmingly, even as urban centers, overwhelmingly choose the PC party now more than ever before. So it's not. We also have to put some onus on the opposition as well. I mean, if we're, and I want to be careful here, if they're advocating effectively and they have effective leadership and they had everything going for them and they were well-oiled machines that could actually compete and they communicated well with each other and they weren't able to make it, we have to make sure that it's a fair fight. But the fact is that we're making decisions based on, brand recognition, based on the politicians that knock on our door, based on the idea that the narrative is that unless we overwhelmingly support our oil industry with every last cell in our body, we're going to lose our homes. They're not necessarily, you can't call them liars for making that argument. You could say that it's their opinion, and people are eating it up.
Yeah, but
So
the
it's
problem
not
with that
necessarily
argument,
their fault.
Yeah, the problem with that argument is why does it have to be a top-down system? You can still make that argument and have it bottom up from the people. Unfortunately, in Alberta, there's a hierarchy at the top of people dictating this province.
Our population allowed it, though, and that's the way that
Yeah.
we like it. The fact is that people don't want to get engaged at this moment. I wish that there was. I wish there was an Alberta Spring, not necessarily because we desperately need it, but because it reinvigorates people's desire to be involved in the democracy. Over here, I guess the bills are paid. You got food on the fridge, a roof on your head. Your kids are in school. It doesn't really make you want to get engaged.
I think the important thing is what Brian was alluding to, and yourself, Adam, is to make people aware, and I think it sinks in over time. But if they're not aware, if they're absorbed in this biased media in Alberta, the mainstream media, they're not going to be aware.
But even then, that's a
Well, we have to
problem.
keep down with the message then. I mean,
Exactly.
eventually,
Keep pounding the message.
Yeah.
But look
Eventually
at
there's a tipping
Egypt.
point.
Yeah.
10 years ago, you would have never saw this coming unless maybe you were on the ground and you.
But
that's true. And I mean, eventually there comes a tipping
Yeah,
point.
you're
And
right.
what people say, will never happen today, well, indeed does happen. I mean, digress to Europe for a moment. I mean, I remember my grandfather, he was absolutely certain that there would be a third world war and it would be thermonuclear. against Soviet Russia. And, if my grandfather were alive today, he would be amazed that the Berlin Wall fell and that communism could have collapsed in the space of just, less than 5 years. All of a sudden the Berlin Wall is down, and we have democracies, more or less. They are democracies in Eastern Europe. They still have some room to go in terms of dealing with some residual corruption. But who could have predicted 35 years ago that you could rent a car in London and ride the Channel and drive all the way to Moscow and pass through borders by just flashing your European Union passport.
Excellent point.
So,
Yeah, we can get there, but we need to, as advocates for a fair and just democratic system, we have to put the onus where it belongs. And the onus, unfortunately, guys, the onus isn't on the media. The onus is not on the PC party or the Alberta party or the NDP. The onus is on the people. And we have to make sure that they understand that the chickens will eventually come home to roost. It might be okay right now, but if they allow it to continue much longer without any semblance of a sense of stewardship for the principles of democracy, then eventually the wolves are going to eat the sheep. That's what happens when the sheep aren't protected.
Aren't they eating them now?
I think they're eating them now.
It's already going on. Look at the wealth that's just through these huge companies that are just going out.
Look at the wealth, and also look at the fact that for the past 2 or 3 elections in this province, the percentage of people who vote has been going down, so that the last election it was close to what it was 40%. 40% voted, and of that, only 40% of that voted for the PC. So the PC's obtaining this overwhelming majority, this lopsided majority, with 1 in 5 Albertans voting for them.
But tell me, who are the people that are voting? Give me the demographic of people that are actually voting. The 40%. The 40% are the middle class that are employed by the oil companies.
True.
They're even
the
upper
elderly.
middle
The
class.
elderly. I think you could vouch for this. That the elderly have the highest proportion.
Oh, yeah.
Will always have the highest proportion of the voting population.
Now, these are people that don't have kids in school, that don't have kids in university,
Right.
that have no interest in a lot of the same infrastructure items that young families or have, and they're the ones that are most represented. Why? Because they're bored. And what about the people that actually? This is a huge. This is insulting. It's insulting to us that the people that have the least to gain and they have the least amount of time left in their lives are the ones that are participating.
I have
so
never
much.
heard that expressed, and it may, there may be something to that. Of what else do you have to do? I don't know.
Maybe mandate voting. Australia did
they
it.
have it in Australia. Yeah.
But get this. The PC party's created a law. It's called mobile assistant voting. So they go to old age homes if there's 10 or more people, and they allow them to vote.
But a person could make an argument that's
We view that as
more-
democratic.
It's more democratic.
It is. We actually view that as long as there's.
But again, who is at fault? Who is the at fault party? If we had to point the finger at a group right now, we can't point the finger at politicians for being effective politicians. Their mandate, their first job 1 is to get elected. Job 2 is all the other stuff. So we can't hold them accountable for doing exactly what we would expect them to do based on their nature. We can't hold the media accountable for giving ad time to the guys that are paying for the commercial spots in between their news segments and have those 2 items dovetail nicely with each other and nicely packaged news story here and some ad space.
But don't they have
here.
an ethical obligation?
There actually is no ethical obligation.
No, there
in,
isn't.
in media. There
But
isn't.
I was thinking
we have,
just like from a humanitarian
oh,
standpoint.
that's bought and sold.
Yeah.
And
okay.
nobody.
Okay.
And again, we can't talk about a right without a corresponding responsibility.
Yeah.
But we only speak in terms of risks and rewards.
Yeah.
If there are no laws compelling one way of doing things, then why not just go the most profitable route?
Right. So Brian and Adam, from a public policy standpoint, the FDA is advocating expenditure limits, because right now in Alberta they don't have them. And we think that's contributing to this insatiable appetite for fundraising and monies.
Expenditure limits on advertising?
No, on candidates and parties campaigns. Because right
Primarily
now
it
it's
would-
through the roof.
But primarily that is advertising. I mean, is that fair to say that
That's
the
any
bulk
type of
their
campaigning. It's all the campaigning expenses.
yeah, getting their message out there and
but,
getting
But right now
supporters.
there's no limit, and same in the U.S. So you get Obama raising $800 million, as you alluded to.
Yeah.
But it's the same in Alberta, and that's where you get these huge disparities. And the problem we're seeing with this is that these loopholes I refer to, which are going to be exposed in this report, and hopefully the public will listen to them and act on them if they feel they're.
Have you ever done any?
Hold on 1 second. I just want to make it. I want to make it a little bit. Revolutions have always happened at universities and places of higher learning all over the world for the entire expanse of human history. Whenever there's been places of higher learning, that's where revolutions. And I don't mean the capital R revolution with people screaming across, down the streets with guns.
Although they can take that effect.
You can. It can. But I mean, revolutions of ideas. I mean, we talk about that marketplace of ideas, basically getting the best idea distilled and synthesized into, quantitative and actionable items that people actually get behind as a population. But you guys also, we also have to come to grips with the fact that our places of higher learning have been infiltrated by these very same, I mean, if you want to talk about Alberta, talk about the oil companies and how much they've heavily invested in the very institution that we're sitting in right now.
I'll give you.
Huge issue.
Yeah.
It's crazy. Yeah, well, you have political science professors at this university
Exactly.
that every single time these political business entities actually engage the public. Those political scientists are there as cheerleaders at this very institution.
Yes,
you
it's
have
unfortunate.
You have the business. You have the business school. It looks like I mean, every different door has a different logo of a different oil company. You have buildings named after people, and you know what? The most extraordinary thing happens is that the government that's actually supposed to be paying for this are actually saying, well, other people are cutting the checks. We're going to extricate ourselves from a position where we have to continue caring about it. So we're shooting ourselves in the foot in so many different ways, and the public is allowing it. The onus is on the public.
Yeah,
in short,
good
gentlemen, if I had to sum up what it is that we can do, you could put expenditure limits, you could put donor limits, you could ask for the disclosures, you can do audits, you can do all of that stuff, but unless it actually resonates with the public, if the public needs to know what is at stake. I mean, the public needs to know what is at stake if they go down this road. We haven't been given enough rope to hang ourselves with. We are a young country. We're a younger province. We have extraordinary wealth. And that is, there are a lot of reasons why the negative consequences of allowing this to happen haven't been well understood, because there's so many factors that are just kind of allowing things to move on and look pretty. In the absence of any of that stuff, we would actually see a dramatic example of, dramatically what allowing this to continue would cause to the average Albertan or the average Canadian. We just need to make the public aware of what's
Yeah.
I'd
happening.
like to segue on that because coincidentally, myself and one of my colleagues earlier today were discussing the poor level of policy and political discourse in this country. And we were talking about how debates amongst politicians and, most importantly, political leaders are structured these days. And all media outlets, including this Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, must share in the blame here, because we remember a time back in the 80s where CBC would have a debate, right? And you'd have Trudeau versus Broadbent, and Broadbent versus Clark on Trudeau, one-on-one, A moderated debate where somebody such as yourself, a neutral person, will be moderating, will be posing the question. Adam and I are on opposite ends of the political spectrum. The question would be posed. Adam would have 5 minutes to make his point. I'd have 5 minutes. You would open the floor up to a panel of political reporters who would ask questions. We'd have an opportunity to answer the questions. We'd have an opportunity to rebut. There were rules that allowed citizens to listen to politicians express their viewpoints. What have we seen in the past 15 to 20 years? We've seen instead, and the CBC is no different from any commercial outlet now, instead we have this free-for-all where people are reduced to shouting at each other. There is no level of public discourse. I think we have to start demanding of our media outlets that they need to revert to a forum that worked in the past in terms of getting ideas out there so that people can have a better idea of what politicians stand for. I think that's one way of improving
I think
the discourse
what
and
would,
the debates.
what would take place if you did that, it would actually have the added benefit. It wouldn't just be the fact that you'd have a forum and a debate and it would be effective and people could learn. It would also reinvigorate people's spirits to learn if they were actually given the opportunity to sit.
Yeah.
But because right now the problem is without actually waking up waking up the public, even if you did have a fair debate and it was balanced, then you had political analysts asking the right questions and people were being civil with each other, only 40% of the people that intend on voting will actually be watching that broadcast. And it's the same 40% that would have voted in the absence of the broadcast, and 9 times out of 10, they would have voted the same way with or without that broadcast based on the brand, based on their own political leanings, based on ideologies and wedge issues. We also can't separate ourselves from the idea right now that there are wedge issues, that people will make up their mind on who to vote for based on how they stand on gun control or the long gun registry, based on how they stand. I can't believe we're still talking about this in 2012 on abortion,
yeah.
Based on where they stand on immigration, and they basically boil down their entire political responsibility to, I agree with this person on abortion and gun control, and a third one, let's call it immigration. Therefore, I'm going to vote for this person come hell or high water, and you cannot convince a person otherwise. You can't tell them, well, there are more important issues at the table. You can't say whether or not they tell you that they agree or disagree with abortion. It's a law that isn't going to change. So it doesn't matter whether or not they agree or disagree. It doesn't. You got entire campaigns that are being built in the United States around the question of abortion, and it's not going to change. They can't. They can't change it. They won't change it. But people don't mind throwing away their vote based on this philosophical idea that they have to vote for somebody that will, at least in public, speak about abortion in terms that they agree on.
Yeah.
So again, guys, we have to throw the onus back on the public and get them to stop voting based on wedge issues. And what happens if there is a debate and there is a moderator and they are being civilized and there's political analysts and the same 40% that are going to vote anyways the way that they were going to vote? What's to say that media outlets that are dissatisfied with that don't put on programs that compete with
well,
it, like
they
in
will.
the
You know
United
what?
States?
They
That
will.
happens.
And you know what? And welcome to democracy.
Exactly.
I
Welcome
mean,
to
you know,
democracy.
do I then get from a party the new Nationalist Party, and we're going to force people at gunpoint to wake up and think? I mean, you know, we're stuck with what we have. Then you know, we're stuck with what we have.
Let's
Yeah.
just, but why not just keep
Yeah.
doing what it is that we're doing right now? Do it with more vigor. Do it with more. With
Well,
more
I mean, I don't know
passion.
what else we can do, right? I mean, we
Yeah.
can't force people to think. We can only ask the questions. We can only have discussions like this. I do think that having a more civilized forum where people are able to articulate positions in response to moderate questions may have an influence on improving that 40%, because we've seen a steady decline over the past 3, 4, 5 elections from the over 70% of eligible voters used to vote in federal elections. It's been steadily declining. So would a reversion or return to that format increase participation? I don't know. Maybe it's room for some speculation that because we live in a a new media age where we're saturated with media, where we live in the Twitter age and instant communications. Maybe we need to look at new ways of doing things. Maybe we need to look at electronic voting, engaging voters in different ways. I mean, has the
Absolutely.
FDA, has the
That's a
FDA done any
fantastic
studies
point.
on whether electronic voting might bring more people into the engage them in the process? I mean, I'm just speculating because I'm not an expert. I have no empirical
That's a
evidence.
fantastic
Right.
idea, but the people in power right now don't want that to happen, specifically
Because
because
they're benefiting from
because
the
they're
old,
benefiting
from the old school.
from the 40%
Yeah, okay.
that are voting based on wedge issues.
Right.
Brian, Adam, really good points. But this evolution of the debates, for example, Brian, would you say that is that the powers to be, the big money interests, just consolidating their power into that?
I think they benefit from it, but I think the people who benefit the most from it are the politicians who are already entrenched. I mean,
But
curiously enough, Stephen Harper didn't want Elizabeth May at the table at the last leaders' debate, but he wasn't the only one. I mean, the Liberals didn't want her there either. None of them wanted Elizabeth May at the table, right?
Yeah.
And yet, the Greens got, just almost 1 million votes across the country in the last couple of elections, but they did not want Elizabeth May at the table.
Yeah. The one question I want to pose to you guys is what came up in the last podcast. Right now in Canada, in Alberta, in the USA, the winning party, the majority, determine the election laws. And there's strong evidence that they do it with a self-serving agenda.
Well, no surprise there.
And my question to both of you is, how can we change that? Because it's creating the structure for what we have in Alberta, which is, I would argue, is significantly favoring the PC party and partly helping them to stay in power.
Again, I'm going to make clear. I don't think that if I don't think a good
Isn't
party-
that undemocratic? It's a complete conflict of interest for people to write their own rules of their electoral game. Let's say Brian, Adam, and I are having a game.
Well,
I win the game, so next game I get to make the
all
rules.
Well, I mean, you're arguing. I'm quite prepared to identify you. Certainly in terms of me. I don't know about your background, Adam, but in terms of me, you're more of an expert on the electoral rules in this province. You are the expert. I'll ask you. I mean, at the federal level, is there not? I mean, Elections Canada that's an independent entity, isn't it?
Yeah.
So is their counterpart here in Alberta very intricately linked to the governing party? Or are they allowed to do what they're allowed to do?
They are a non-partisan, independent organization, but they're dependent on the funds of the assembly. They basically implement the rules of the game of the majority there. Their sole mandate is just to run the election the way the politicians want it run. That's it.
Yeah,
They are a non-factor. They're actually almost complicit in any electoral fairness that's going on. They're just perpetuating it.
Yeah, no,
They're actually the enforcers of it.
So
They make sure
absent
people.
any
They have no voice.
So without some kind of public outcry and
Yeah.
organized public lobbying to change the rules of the game, then we're stuck with what we have.
Yeah. So we're actually advocating, Brian, and maybe this is something your research center can look at. But we personally think we think from a philosophical, from a legal standpoint, from an ethical standpoint, from a democratic standpoint, on, that the winning politicians, the majority of them, should not set the rules of the next game, next round. That actually there should be some kind of elected citizen body representing the regions of Alberta, for example, deciding it. It's not perfect, but at least it might give us a more fair system.
But I mean, a person can make the argument
We'll
that
talk later. But
Yeah.
this is something we've talked about
Yeah.
doing a study on, actually.
Yeah.
somebody can make the argument that the people elected have the moral authority from the people that elected them to actually make those laws, specifically because we trusted them enough to elect them, then we implicitly trust them enough to carry out laws that they may or may not have an interest in. They actually have that authority. One could even go further and make the argument that if you appointed a special tribunal to make these rules or recommendations or changes and to make them and to implement them, that they don't have the same authority as the elected representatives because they weren't elected to begin with. And it goes back to the argument of, should judges be elected?
But Adam, you're overlooking. I said elected citizen body that would focus solely on the election laws. Because that's what they use to justify it. They say they're elected, so fine, we will elect a citizen body to do it. They're no better or worse than you, but they're elected, so it cancels that argument out.
Yeah.
And that's what we're pushing for.
It's an intriguing idea. I think it's certainly an idea worth consideration. And
For sure.
It's not perfect, Brian.
Well, no, there's no such thing as a perfect system. And anytime somebody talks about a perfect system and perfecting human nature, I get very scared because we've seen examples in the past century of political movements which wanted to perfect men, and 25 years later, we're seeing millions of people put into death camps. So I'm much rather dealing with imperfect human beings, being an imperfect human being myself.
I want to add a point here, what Adam said there too, because we're putting out this electoral fairness report on Alberta, and I'll send it to both of you.
Please.
It's a massive document. We put every ounce of energy we have into it. But our intent is to do what Adam's saying. We're going to have a press conference. We're going to invite the media. We're going to invite all the political representatives from the party. And we're going to invite individuals like you yourself just to inform you on it. But the intent...
I should send an invitation to well, not only to me, but to the center itself. Because I will tell you that, we at the center, after the last election, there was a lot of discussion about whether we should undertake some kind of an examination of the democratic process in Alberta. So I can't presume to think what Linda's next project is going to.
But we could work together. Exactly.
There is a possibility.
Hold on a sec. But I just want to be clear. The intent of this is to A, inform the public, but also B, inform the political parties of these reforms which we're backing up.
At least
and hopefully some of the parties will adopt them, but then it would link in, then the public could vote for them, and hopefully they would facilitate the change.
if nothing else,
You see
the
that process?
politicians,
Yeah.
if nothing else, the politicians will.
Yeah, so that's what we're going to be doing.
If nothing else, the politicians will understand that that's a priority. But again, I mean, the most important thing is to keep doing exactly what it is that we're doing. Try to reach as many people as possible, and understand that while the system can be better, and it's certainly not perfect. I mean, take a look at France, and take a look at England, and take a look at Germany, and take a look at Spain. The only time you got millions of people in the streets is when France changed the retirement age from 65 to 67. You had 4 million people come down and make a big fuss. Why? Because it's affecting them. In England, the stuff that happened with the students and their tuition, millions of people went down the street because it's affecting them. If everybody's, unfortunately, we're conditioned that if everybody's bills are paid, if everybody's rent is paid, if everybody's got groceries in their fridge, if all of their kids are getting educated, it's that impetus to act, unfortunately, isn't there. So we actually need to get out there and hammer this point through.
Exactly, but you got to be careful of placing limits, Adam.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of unknowns.
Yes.
Right? And it's possible if these unfairness issues are hammered and the arguments are extremely strong, obviously the opposition would counteract them with whatever reports they want. But if they're hammered, maybe it can reach them, right?
Yeah.
And I want to make it, just based on the conversation too, about the institutions in Alberta, I look at the Senator Brian represents, the FDA, and other organizations. It's like we've had to remove ourselves from those institutions, and now we're in the public domain because those institutions have been infiltrated. So we're actually out in the streets, so to speak, because we can't go there. We have to go here.
Yeah.
I think it's important that we get, to use your metaphor, get out in the streets. I mean, certainly one of the discussions which we have had at the centre over the past while is how do we get our message out there. I mean, we write these reports, and a dozen people buy them every year. We'll write articles and commentaries that people read in newspapers, but how effective is that in the YouTube age? So on that note, I'm starting my first training session tomorrow at NUTV. I'm learning how to edit, and I'll learn how to shoot, and we're going to be eventually, once I'm trained, we'll be putting together commentaries, myself, Linda, my colleagues, and uploading them to YouTube. Yeah. And in my wildest dreams, a commentary about voting rights might be the next Justin Bieber viral video. I'm being
You're just as cute.
No, it's interesting.
Thank you.
I think that's
But I mean,
right there.
joking aside, I mean, I think that that is how we reach people. And I mean, I'm being partially facetious, but then again, you don't know. I mean, there will be an issue that may very well galvanize people, and a commentary does go viral and it wakes people up. I mean, I think that we need to look at using new media, and let's face it, YouTube is out there. We've got to make use of it.
Exactly.
And podcasts.
And I think that basically what you just did, what you just said, you answered the question. How best do we contribute to making money matter less in politics? And that's speaking directly to the people.
Yeah.
We have okay, so we've acknowledged that there are flaws with the system, so we're working within a flawed system to actually to have this dialogue. And the people that we want to have the dialogue with are people that are benefiting from the system being flawed. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to put too much energy in it. The media benefits from the system being flawed. The politicians benefit from the system being flawed. So why engage them anymore? Why not engage the voters directly, because they're the ones that are actually going to be impactful. And I think starting up channels and YouTubes and having conversations like this and taking them into the public forum. When was the last time? I've lived in this city since I was born. I've never driven down the street and seen a public forum about electoral fairness. I've never seen it. It's never happened. Ever. Not once have I seen a public forum on electoral fairness or food safety or anything like that. We are engaging the wrong people, I think.
Adam, I know you know this, and you probably know this too, but I mean, in Britain, in another age, in the pre-electronic media age, every city had its speaker's corner, right, where anybody could mount the dais and talk. And so you get the raving lunatic would get up there and people would throw tomatoes at him. But occasionally you'd have somebody like Adam or you would stand up there and make a point. And in a pre-electronic age, this is how people not only got their information, it's how they were entertained. And if you were an engaging speaker, you'd have an audience of hundreds, maybe thousands of people. We don't live in that age anymore. We live in an electronic media age. This is our speaker's forum. And it's cheap. I mean, my God, I'm learning how to make videos at NUTV for $30. Where are you going to learn how to make a video for $30?
Yeah, but what's coming down the pipeline is actually, it could be censorship. They're actually, the Harper government is...
that's another podcast.
Hold on a second.
That's another podcast.
I just want to add as a footnote here.
Yeah.
I don't want to add a negative vein here, but there's a bill called C-30, and it totally tramples Article 8 of the Charter for unlawful search and
seizure.
So they can go to anyone's electronic.
Oh yes, we're talking about that today. But there's been a pushback though. I mean, I read there was an article I read just an hour before coming here where the Conservatives have decided to put this bill into committee, which means that there's going to be talk of some amendments. And one of my colleagues made the point really eloquently earlier today. She said, it's so sadly ironic that on the one hand you've got this government that we've got the right to bear arms, and you've got no right to, we're free to bear arms, and yet they don't make the connection between that aspect of freedom and intellectual freedom.
Brian, another thing I would suggest in terms of getting the voice out and reaching the people, and I think it's an excellent idea, especially in the context of Alberta, where about 60% of the population don't vote. So there's probably a good percentage of that population that doesn't vote that is sympathetic to our views. So I think it's a good idea to speak to them if you can, if you understand them, speak to them. But also, I really think it's important to network like we're doing tonight. having you hear from another organization. You know, we can share reports
Yeah.
and vice versa. That's going to empower both organizations, and we're going to grow and get our message out,
Yeah.
right? I
Yeah.
think that's a huge thing.
A lot of the 60% that don't vote specifically because of problems like this.
Exactly.
I know a lot of intelligent
Exactly.
people that are so frustrated that they don't vote. I mean,
Yeah, this is true.
It's true.
So,
It's
so
true.
if
It's true.
Yeah.
that's another thing.
So don't, Adam. I would suggest don't underestimate the undercurrent out there.
Of course.
Because look at the Arab Spring.
Yeah.
Like nobody saw that coming.
Nobody.
Not even the Pentagon.
No.
And they
That's
have
true.
their pulse on almost
Yeah.
everything in the world.
That's true.
And they actually, the Pentagon now has set up a system for monitoring now. Facebook, Twitter, so they can try and see these things coming.
Wow.
Yeah.
So we've started the Alberta Spring.
Is there any closing remarks?
I think if I was going to close something like this on as positive a note as possible, speaking to people directly to voters, as you were saying, Brian, it's actually never been easier and
Nor cheaper.
nor cheaper. And I think that we should marginalize the mass media because they're not relevant anymore. I mean, actually, their relevance is declining dramatically.
It's true.
And
I don't watch news anymore. I've not watched
exactly.
news for 3 years.
Yeah, yeah.
And I don't feel misinformed.
But
In fact, I'm more informed.
where it pertains to politics, the mass media does have a role because people are getting their political news from the media. But we should just allow them to. We shouldn't waste a whole lot of energy on the broken system. We should engage people right away. We should continue to have conversations like this. You should continue making videos.
Yeah.
There is a change coming.
Yeah.
I really do believe that we are going to be impactful because of the desire to be free and the desire to live in a democracy, a fair democracy. That is something that's universal. It's all over the planet.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's right here in Alberta.
It is.
Exactly.
As the late great Chris Hitchens, I mean, I didn't agree with his positions necessarily on Iraq, but I think that in general, Chris Hitchens was one of the intellectual giants and voices of our time. I mean, Chris Hitchens once, you could see the man was dying of cancer, but he was still very eloquent, and he said, there is an innate need, all humans have an innate need for love, we all have an innate need to be heard, and we all have an innate desire to be free. And he said, you can't convince me that people even in North Korea don't have a desire to be free and don't have a desire to be treated as human beings and with dignity. And I think he's right. And I think that we need to forget about the old ways of doing things and as Adam said, use this new media at our disposal. It has never been easier to reach people, and it's never been cheaper.
Are there any questions or comments from the observers?
Yes.
Okay.
You were talking about how to awaken people to the fact that there's something wrong in the democracy. I think the way it happened for me, the way it awakened me was with the labor laws. I noticed this when I worked as a contract worker in Ontario, Southern Ontario, which has been very hard hit with the deindustrialization. And one thing that hit me was, as a contract worker, how little rights you have. You were basically legally like chattel, like movable property and disposable property. And I remember thinking to myself, this can't be a democracy when people can be treated like that. Even though people work hard, they try to put in an honest effort for honest day's pay, but legally you're not. And it's because of that. It's gone to that point because companies are cutting costs, trying to cut costs left and right, and there's this economic justification for putting people into this straitjacket of contract work, even though the result is more and more people have no rights on the job. So that's what awakened me, that something is seriously wrong in this, what we call democracy, and that's not really democratic. And that's where, you talk about hitting people in the pocket. That's where the labor was.
Indeed, and I see it as a very serious broach of what I call the social contract. I mean, up until a generation ago, there was this notion that older people had an obligation to younger people to pass on the benefits, and indeed the expectation was that the next generation would earn more money than the previous generation, and yet for the past 30 years, incomes have been declining, and this marginalization of workers, which you have alluded to, with contract work and related to that, unpaid intern work, is impacting overwhelmingly people who are under 35 years old. I mean, there's an entire generation there has not been a generation in history that is more educated than people who have been born since 1980. I mean, there are people with MAs and PhDs who are working unpaid internships in this country, in America, throughout Western Europe, for 2, 3, 4 years, and they're not being paid for this. So I think it's a horrible situation, and I think we need to address that. And I think we need to look at who is benefiting from this, and it is obviously the corporate sector. They're getting the benefit of your intelligence, your education, but they don't have to pay benefits. And indeed, in the worst case scenario, I mean, there are people who are working as unpaid interns, and that's essentially slave labor.
I agree, but if they can get away with it and they're not breaking any laws, why not take advantage?
They're going to take advantage of it.
Well, they're going to take advantage of it.
That's
So
true.
the problem is that they exist within a framework that allows it.
Mm-hmm.
The only way that it won't be allowed is if the public understands your plight. They can't. You can't wait until everybody
It's
that
not just my plight.
exactly.
It's expanding.
It's
So
expanding.
Yeah.
But
everybody's
the thing is that we can't wait until every contractor loses health benefits or loses their job or loses their right to earn before they actually get to the table. By then it'll be too late, and it'll never happen. You're never going to have enough unemployed contractors to affect change. So the only way that it's going to work is if we actually mobilize behind a principle,
Yeah.
mobilize behind an ideal of equity, not equality. Equality is.
But you first got to awaken people first before that. That's
Yeah.
what I'm saying.
Yeah.
That's what went in my
Yeah,
mind. So this
sure.
is no democracy.
Yeah.
And how do we do that? I mean, I think we look to our Arab brothers and sisters who used social media to mobilize people. I mean, here we are in Canada, in America, in Western Europe, and I mean, most people use social media to pass along jokes or, the latest photo of Britney Spears showing her hooch, I mean, whereas in that part of the world, people use social media to mobilize. So I think that we need to use, to get back to the point that you made earlier, in which I reiterated and reinforced, is we have the social media at our disposal. We've got to use it to talk about these issues and mobilize people.
One more question. We were talking about the Heritage Fund and how it's less in real terms than it was before.
Yeah.
But hasn't an analysis been done on what we have to show for that? I mean, it'd be a scandal if it went down and we have nothing to show for it, but we do have a lot to show for it.
No,
I thought it was infrastructure.
we have no. Actually, the infrastructure was actually those modest piece of infrastructure. I believe it was the interest on the principal that we were able to actually spend on it.
That's my
We haven't
understanding
actually
as well.
touched the principal, so it's been sitting there stagnating and losing value. And we've been kind of skimming the interest off the top, and it's not even good interest. It's not like the interest that you would expect to get on a sum that big. It's modest, very, very modest interest. If we actually, and this is another podcast, but if we took that money and invested it in really impactful ways in our province, we'd have a lot more to show for it. I mean, I know that we're all capitalists and stuff like that, but the fact of the matter is that we've taken not just a back seat to private interests in our oil industry. We've taken no seat at all. We've said, you guys do the work, cut us a pittance of a check once in a while, and we'll be happy with you destroying the environment, marginalizing our Aboriginal people. We could have had our own interests represented far better, and we chose not to.
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely. I think a rough analogy could be made between what Adam has correctly said has happened with that Heritage Fund to imagine if, instead of investing money in an RRSP and investing some money in some growth equity funds, you just kept your money in a low interest bearing checking account all your life. And at the end of your life, what do you have? Your money hasn't grown and worked for you.
And not only that, the money loses value.
It loses value because of inflation eating away.
It's pegged against paper. It's paper pegged against more paper. The paper is losing value. You got real commodities that have quadrupled in price, like gold. The fact of the matter is that the money is far less valuable today than it ever was.
Thank you very much for listening in to this episode of the Foundation for Democratic Advancements podcast. For the FDA to continue to improve democratic processes worldwide, we rely upon your generous donations. Donate to the FDA. Please visit our website at www.democracychange.org.